Everyone, welcome to Data Engineers Lunch number 79. We'll give everyone a minute or so to file in and we'll get started soon shortly. Alrighty, hey everyone, welcome to Data Engineers Lunch number 79. Today's talk is going to be on data governance, and today's talk is going to be given by Will Angel, who's a Senior Technical Product Manager at Caribou Financial. Today's talk is going to focus on data governance, the second 90% of data engineering projects. Co-organizers for this event are Rahul and Akwi. If you're looking at giving a talk here at Data Engineers Lunch or Sister Lunch, Cassandra Lunch, feel free to reach out to Akwi. His email is listed below. Also, if you're interested in sponsoring one of the events, feel free to reach out to Akwi. We are a part of Data Community DC, which is Will is also a part of. Data Community DC believes in building an inclusive environment, so no matter your race, gender, or sexual orientation, everyone is welcome, and we expect the respect to be given to all. Data Community DC is built of a bunch of different organizations. Data Engineers Lunch falls under Data Wranglers DC. So if you're interested in all the various events hosted by Data Community DC, you can find out more at datacommunitydc.org. So what do we cover here at Data Engineers Lunch? We cover everything from the ingress to egress of data and everything that happens in between, as well as everything in the back end as well. So once you've cleaned your data, you've moved it from your E to the L, and now you got to do your data governance on it to make sure you're not running it into compliance issues. You need to make sure your data is visible across your organization. So things like data governance come into play. If you're new here, say hi, hello in the YouTube chat. If you have a question, feel free to ask it. We'll be shuttling the questions for Will here. So if you have any comments or questions, feel free to drop it in the YouTube chat. And please do share what you know with us. This is meant to be a community, so the more you know, the more everyone will know. Here at Anant, we design, build, and manage global real-time data analytics platforms surrounding Cassandra, Spark, and Kafka. So data engineering is a way of life for us. GW University helps provide venue space when we have in-person events. We also have some organizational institutional sponsors. If anyone has any jobs that they're looking for or has any jobs that they're offering, feel free to drop links in the YouTube chat, as well as any meetups, hackathons, conferences, or classes. Feel free to drop links in the YouTube chat. Anant is hiring full-time, part-time positions, data platform operators, engineers, architects. You can find out more at careers.anant.us. Upcoming events, Cassandra lunches every Thursday at noon Eastern, and Data Engineers lunches every Monday at noon Eastern. You can find all our events on our events page at anant.us/events. We've also released our 9th Apache Cassandra runbook, so get it while you can. We'll drop the link in the YouTube chat. Today is the last day you can get it for free. And with that, we'll be releasing our 10th Apache Cassandra runbook tomorrow as well. This one specifically covers getting started with Cassandra troubleshooting, so some tips and tricks and know-hows of how you can diagnose and troubleshoot your down nodes. And with that, we'll hand it over to our speaker for today, Will.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much for the intro. I'm excited to be here again. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And that should be the presentation slides now. So today I'm going to be talking about data governance, which in my view is the sort of second part of any data engineering project. And there's this thing called the 90-90 rule, which is an aphorism by Tom Cargill of Bell Labs, which is that the first 90% of a software project accounts for the first 90% of the development time. The remaining 10% of the code accounts for the other 90% of the development time. The joke here being that software projects tend to go at least double in terms of project timelines. And I think for data, this is especially true, both in general for specific projects, and especially on the data governance and data management side. So you may ask, double time for a data project, 180%? That seems unreasonable. As professionals, we should be able to estimate accurately how much time things will take, right? Well, the answer is yes, but for the Data Wranglers DC Meetup About page, the introduction is 80 to 90% of time spent on data projects is gathering data and putting it into a format you can analyze. So again, that first 90%. But then I think that without good data governance, you end up spending not just twice, but 3 times as much effort and time on a data project. First, that first 90%, actually getting the data and formatting it. Second is dealing with the chaos of having inconsistently managed data. Any data engineering professionals will have had the experience at some point of having data and then realizing that other data was formatted inconsistently, documented, not documented. There's all endless number of ways to mismanage data. And eventually, once you have mismanaged data, you're going to have to go ahead and spend additional time to manage the data, even if you intentionally chose not to, because in the end, unmanaged data is very low in value. So if you don't intentionally choose to do data governance, you'll end up spending at least 2, if not 3 times as much time per data project. And again, it's all based on an aphorism, but I think there is some truth here. So today I'm going to be talking about data governance, some of the implementation details of data governance, a little bit about the data lifecycle and how governance applies throughout the lifecycle, and then a sort of quick section at the end on, is data governance a part of data engineering? So first off, what is data governance? It's a great question, and the answers you'll get will depend on who you ask. Data governance is very context dependent, and Gwen Thomas, the founder of the Data Governance Institute, which is one of the sort of larger, more established groups in the space, said that it means different things to different people, and that it can be perceived as a complicated endeavor. Most of you, when you hear data governance, you probably think about compliance, risk management, trouble getting access to data, all the things that make data not fun, like a lot of large enterprise bureaucracy. And when it comes to the answer for what is data governance, it also depends on who you're talking to, because data governance is a buzzword that is used by a lot of vendors and companies to try and sell you some platform, because everybody's platform is somehow involved with data governance. So there is a lot of noise in the space, but also actually something to data governance. It's more than just a buzzword. So what is data governance? To actually answer the question, I would define data governance as the art of anticipating, preventing, and mitigating the risks, costs, and headaches that come with every new data source throughout the data lifecycle. So basically, it's about maximizing the total value and minimizing the total cost of data by managing the processes and policies that we use to actually operate in our day-to-day data management, data engineering practices. On the right here, you'll see a diagram. This is the University of Maine Systems data governance diagram. They have a number of very good public reports on how they do data governance in their university system. And you'll note here that there are a whole bunch of different things, because data governance as a sort of metaform of data management is a very wide discipline that sort of gets at the core of the intersection of people, process, and technology. And as you all know, as data engineers, data is complex, and there's just a lot of systems and a lot of tools, and they vary depending on the entity, organization that it's practiced in. So data governance is a part of data management, and really it's a part of how we do data well as an organization. And just like good leadership and governance in general, if data governance is done well, it's fairly unremarkable and doesn't feel like a chore. So if it's done well, it feels appropriate. And if you have to request access to some data, it makes sense why you'll have to do that. There could be security concerns, it may be sensitive data. And so if the governance is done well, the regular data management should feel reasonably sane on a day-to-day basis. So again, data governance is contextual. The context that you're operating in may determine how you want to approach it. And there are a lot of frameworks out there. They're not one size fits all. If you're at a very small company, like a startup or a medium company, that should feel different than data governance at a government agency or at a really big corporation. Likewise, if you're in a regulated industry like healthcare or finance, the data really matters because you may have additional requirements from a legal and risk perspective. And those can be too expensive to ignore. So depending on where you're operating, what kind of data it is, you may have additional compliance requirements. And the last thing is that the organization's culture and history matter. If you don't have a history of strong governance and strong data management, it's going to be harder to move to a place where you have good data management, data governance. And so there are a lot of consulting companies that will happily sell you a digital transformation with lots of data governance. And you have to be thoughtful about how you evolve your data governance, because a waterfall implementation of some framework is unlikely to stick and make a long-term difference. And so data governance is an ongoing process. Now, some of you might ask, why do we need this? I don't want compliance. I don't want to deal with stuff. It's a huge hassle. I just want to get data around real fast and make things happen. And the answer is data governance can be data anarchy. Anarchy is a form of government, or intentional form of not government, some would say. So that is an intentional choice to not do data governance well. At a lot of companies, it's often informal. And so you'll have a lot of things where it's just individual people doing data well, or in their view, doing data. And sometimes that's just the governance if it's a small enough place. So questions like, or if you hear comments like, don't forget to revoke access for people when they leave, that's informal data governance. Asking about who can change data sets, who has that level of control and authority, again, a data governance type question. And as we've said, data governance is often regarded as a hindrance. And in a lot of organizations, data governance is overly focused on compliance and risk, and doesn't think a lot about using data governance to improve the actual working experience of people who are trying to make data useful and just do their jobs. So data governance also requires getting people to agree on how they interact and work, and people are hard. I hope that everyone listening's problems can stay technical, because as you get into the people side of data, it becomes hard to get teams to agree on how to interact, how to work together, how to do things consistently. And even within teams, just getting teams to agree on a standard for, say, what quality of documentation you want with a new data set, or what quality you want for monitoring a new data pipeline. That can be really hard. And technical problems can be hard too. But as you get into the people side, they become much larger and slower to resolve. So what are some of the benefits? Why do we do this? If there are real costs with data governance, it takes time and effort. And if you're large enough, you'll have to hire more people, buy new tools, spend more on infrastructure. So there are real costs there. So let's talk about the benefits. And there are sort of two broad groups of things where data governance is useful. One is on the compliance side, like sometimes you simply have to follow the law. But then also there are benefits from a data management perspective. And I think that data governance, like I said, is sort of how you enable data management. And good data management helps that your data is used effectively, it's used efficiently, it's your data is impactful, it's easy to use, easy to get access to, it's stored securely, the storage and processing is compliant, and especially in Europe these days, that compliance part for the storage and processing is very, very important and can be very expensive. And also making sure that the data use and storage has minimal risk. At a previous company I worked at, they had suffered a data breach where hackers installed crypto locker software, brought down their whole network for weeks, and some employees had old files downloaded onto their computers that had personal information, including social security numbers for the employees and for students of the entity. And they were still dealing with that data breach over a year later while I was there. So it can be very expensive to suffer a data breach. And so keeping the risk there minimal is very desirable. So again, the goal is to have high quality data that's used to drive an impact while reducing the total cost and risk of that data. So that's sort of data governance at a high level. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the implementation details and things that you may want to focus on while actually doing data governance. So we've got a list of questions here that you may be interested in, or rather, if you're asking these questions, you're doing data governance effectively. These are questions like real basic: how is data accessed and used? Who is accountable for our data? And then you get into more interesting process ones like, how do you respond when business requirements change? How do you track access and monitor the use of data? How do you handle data lifecycle management? That can get real tricky. And then you start getting into interesting, more compliance questions of, do you have a process for revoking data access when someone doesn't or shouldn't have it anymore, or doesn't need or shouldn't have it anymore? And then, what types of data do you have? Do you have PII, other sensitive information? And are there laws that apply to your storage and usage and collection of the data? And if so, what are the legal liabilities, and how do you implement policies to mitigate those risks and harms? So if you're asking questions like this, you're actually engaging in data governance. So broadly speaking, to bring up this chart again, there are a couple of specific data governance concerns and sort of four broad pillars of data governance, which are data quality, data access and security, data standardization and policies, and compliance and risk management. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into each of these topics. So, data quality. I believe that data quality is a result of good data management and good data governance processes. So if you have sort of good processes in place for making sure that new data sets are brought in well, you tend to end up with better data. And so part of that is simply having standards around data and metadata management. If you say that every new table has to have some kind of documentation, every new data set likewise is properly stored in a certain way, that can be very helpful. Now, likewise, keeping track of having standards for metadata and the tools to store that, and things like metadata catalogs. Data catalogs are very exciting and are very useful from a governance perspective. Likewise, having good metadata allows you to do data lineage, where where something in the data, know where the data came from. It appears to be a typo. Oops. Likewise, for data delivery, having standards for your data pipelines to make sure that they run correctly, as well as the tooling to monitor those for observability, is very important. Likewise, being able to have standards for data integrity and having things like backups and auditability to make sure that your data is trusted is very important for ensuring data quality. And the more people trust your data, the easier everything is as a data engineer. Because if people trust your data, they won't ask you as many questions about, is it correct? Where did it come from? If you have all of that already, and there's integrity in the data, that makes people's use of the data more effective and makes your life as a data engineer easier. So the second pillar is data access and security. And in short, you want the right people to have fast access to data and the wrong people to have the worst time imaginable getting your data. So basically, you want the right people to have access and the right people to never have access. And that means things like having processes for determining what people actually are the right people in terms of having access to a data set. And that can get really tricky when you start, especially at smaller companies, when you have people who are effectively in multiple roles and may be able to access data for some legitimate purpose that they could also use internally at the company in a way that wouldn't be compliant. The classic example is having, an analyst who is working with both product and marketing. And if they're doing product analytics, they may need to have access to some data set of customer activity that they may not have consent to use for marketing purposes. So sometimes it really is just about trusting individuals, but as companies and organizations scale up, the trust needs to partially move from individuals to the process to make sure that there are checks in place so that if you trust someone, you can then verify later that they have acted according to that trust. And then another big thing is just security. Make sure that the data storage and processing is secure, that you use encrypted, keep your systems up to date, as well as having a incident management process so that if there is a data breach or suspected data breach, you have some idea of how to respond. And in many cases, there are legal requirements, especially around PII, about how you have to respond in the event of an incident. And so if you believe that there has been a data breach, in many parts of the world, you are required to notify someone or notify the government within 24 hours. And indeed, I believe back in, I think it was 2017 or 2018, Equifax in the US leaked data on, I think it was 150 million Americans, and they got fined something like $500 million by the US government. And one of the things that contributed to the size of that was that they knew about the breach internally for weeks before making it public or going to the government about it. So they're having an incident management process, or at least being aware of what your requirements are there, is, I think, an important part of good data security. So the third pillar is standards and policies. And these help make your data more consistent if you have standards about how each new data set should happen. So the sort of two things there is, if you have standards and policies, it allows for individual data users and creators to operate faster and more consistently. If you're working as a data engineer and you know that there are certain standards that any new pipeline has to meet and standards for documentation, those are guidelines for how you can do your job. And so there, you can just say, okay, we've got a new data set. It needs to be documented according to these standards. So that makes it very easy to do it, as opposed to having to think about, what level of documentation do you want for every data set? So you can sort of make some of those individual choices a matter of policy. And then, like I mentioned, if you have a standard or policies and processes that are documented, you can then verify that access controls are in place and are being followed for compliance purposes, which leads into the fourth pillar, compliance and risk management. So there are laws and regulations that you as an organization that uses data are required to follow, as well as plenty of people who will sue you over data mismanagement. There are people who, if you've done business with them and have their personal data, and they don't like what you've done with it, they may file lawsuits or otherwise make your life inconvenient, and that can be expensive. GDPR allows for fines of up to 4% of global revenue, or 20 million, whichever is higher. And that's a lot of money. If you're a company that's doing $1 billion in revenue every year, that is a significant amount of money. And even if you don't actually get fined, the amount of money and time that you'll have to spend dealing with any regulatory issues is huge. That's a lot of time that you're not investing in your data systems. That's time that you're not spending on other things. So it can be very expensive to have any kind of regulatory or legal issues. A couple of ways to reduce and manage this risk is to have formal and automated access controls, document your processes and controls, have data usage and privacy policies published and followed. That's basically a requirement to just operate as a business these days. You can also minimize your data collection and retention. If you're not collecting data, you have nothing to lose. If you're not storing data for very long, you have nothing to get hacked. So minimizing data collection and retention can be a very effective strategy. And also, if you're in a place to do it, have people dedicated to data management and compliance. If it's someone's job to make sure that your data is both secure, high quality, and accessible, all this data governance and data management, if it's someone's job, it's very easy to say, this person is responsible for making sure that everyone does their part in keeping data secure. Like, it can't be one person's job. It's really a sort of cultural effort. The whole organization needs to be involved. But if there's one person responsible for making sure that everyone in the organization is aware of that, that can be really effective. So as far as compliance goes, I want to play this short clip from the TV show Silicon Valley about data, the sort of issues of data compliance and what that can cost.
It appears that 33% of your users are under the age of 13. It's also apparent that you have no parental permission requirements in place. You're going to want to sit down for this. Are you familiar with COPPA?
Who? It's the Children's Online Privacy and Protection Act.
This act establishes strict guidelines to protect the privacy of younger children on the internet. You are in gross violation of this act.
You know how kids can't have a YouTube or Facebook account till they're 13? It's because of this.
Yes, but our users are chatting with each other, Jared, not some old creep.
No offense.
None taken? My shame will linger even after my voting rights are restored. Now, are there records of these chats on your server?
Yeah, we store everything. What's going on? How serious is this?
Each violation of COPPA carries a penalty of $16,000.
So we're fined $16,000? Oh no. I hope they take cash.
$16,000 per user.
Not only each user, each use.
So 51,000 estimated underage users times an average 25.6 chat sessions per user times $16,000.
$21 billion?
So that is the, I think, type of enforcement of that type of privacy regulation, I think, would be good for society at large. But from a data governance perspective, is the type of thing that keeps people awake at night, because the wrong type of data storage and lack of compliance with the relevant regulation can be an existential threat to businesses. So if you end up dealing with PI data and you don't store that properly, that's the kind of thing that could potentially put an organization out of business or do significant damage, both financial and reputational. So data governance, especially for larger companies and ones that store sensitive data, is very important. So let's not play that again. Conveniently, there are frameworks for doing data governance. There are a bunch of different ones. One of the ones that I will mention is the data governance framework from the Data Governance Institute. And if you're interested in starting a data governance, that's a great, if you're starting a data governance initiative, the DGI is a great resource. And as you can see, the framework gets pretty complicated pretty fast, but it actually starts making sense in terms of sort of figuring out what you want from a data governance perspective, and then implementing the sort of processes to create those data governance processes. So that's some of the implementation details of data governance. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the data lifecycle. So every data set, every data project goes through a lifecycle, and there are a lot of different ways that you can sort of slice and dice the lifecycle, especially depending on what industry or domain you're operating in. The data lifecycle is going to be different if you are doing internal data for a business, if you're doing academic data, other public data. Like it really depends on the domain and industry you're operating in. But this is pretty representative of a lot of sort of data life cycles where ideally, though, a lot of people skip this step. You sort of create a plan for what data you want, where you're going to put it, and how it's going to be useful. And then you go ahead and collect or create the data. You then process the data so that you can analyze it. So that's the real part where this group shines, processing and analyzing data. And then you, depending on how you want to do things, you can like archive or back up the data, give access to it internally or externally if it's going to be public, and then either continue just learning from it or reuse it. And then that feeds back into the cycle where, you've gotten some data, you've looked at the data, and then if you're not done, you're going to go back and get more. And for many of you, this will be very familiar to the software development lifecycle, which is really about like how do you effectively develop software. And the data lifecycle lives with most software, especially if you do product analytics and want to know how people are using your software product. One thing to note here is that the data management and governance for each stage is going to be slightly different. And it also depends, again, on the domain and the context there in terms of determining when you need to implement controls, what level of controls, etc. So again, data governance needs to be something that is fairly adaptive depending on where a data project is. One thing to note in the data lifecycle as it relates to data management, data governance, is that eventually data will be in either maintenance mode or you will want to take it to end of life and deprecate some data source. Data tends to have a natural lifespan, and a lot of data has the value fall off very rapidly. And in the case of software observability, most software applications will emit tons and tons and tons of logs, incredible volumes of data in the form of logs. And for most of that data, after an hour or two out through that first day, 24 hours, so after a couple of hours, the value of that log data decays rapidly. And if you stored it forever, your costs of storage would just keep going up and up and up and up. And you'd have so much data that it would be hard to find any relevant information. So because of that, actually getting rid of older data can be very valuable so that you don't have to store as much, you don't have to manage as much, and it's easier for people to navigate. if you have a data warehouse, if you have a couple of tables, that's much easier to navigate than if you have a couple of thousand tables. And if you've got a couple of thousand of mostly undocumented tables of varying quality, because you haven't done a great job of data management and data governance, you're going to have a really hard time, and it's going to be a much bigger cleanup effort. So think about maintenance and end-of-life policies, and don't let your data storage become a Superfund site that's going to require significant cleanup and remediation. So it can be very helpful to have default data retention policies. So you can just say, by default, you'll delete some types of data after 1 year or 6 months or 5 years. And sometimes you're also required to keep data around for a certain period of time for legal reasons. So an important thing to think about so that you don't end up with data that you weren't planning on how to maintain and eventually retire. So getting to the last part of the talk, I want to talk about, is data governance a part of data engineering? And at the end of the day, my answer is kind of. Data governance is a part of data management, and data management can't be data engineering alone, because you need the people, the process, and technology to all work together to really spin that data flywheel and drive business value. So it can't be data engineering, going it alone. But at the same time, data governance is a part of how we, as practitioners and organizations, win with data and deliver massive amounts of business value. And there, because we as data engineers are the ones building and operating those pipelines, it would be unwise for us to ignore data governance, because, again, if governance affects data management, which affects how we build and operate our pipelines and documented data sources, not being involved in the data governance process means that someone else in an organization can just tell you, every new data set needs to have 10 pages of documentation per column and other ridiculous things, which hopefully the people are reasonable and the people doing governance actually understand how data works. At sufficiently large organizations, they may be sufficiently divorced from the actual day-to-day practice that governance may not be good on the ground. So being involved with data governance and really having a stake and opinion about how data as a whole works at the organization is wise for us as data engineers. And good governance, I do believe, results in good data management, which means that you then have documentation and people expect you to have documentation, which reduces the number of repetitive questions that you end up getting asked. So as data engineers, we should welcome good governance and work to make it better so that we can focus on doing the interesting parts of our job and not doing the more boring parts again and again and again. So I'm going to go over a couple of key takeaways before going to questions. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the YouTube chat and we will address them. So, key takeaways. First, data governance is how you control and enable data management. And good data management is a key part in how you win with data and deliver massive business value. So good governance results in more data work going more smoothly. And that's both more enjoyable as a practitioner if your work is generally smoother, maybe not easier, but at least more consistent. And from a business perspective, work going more smoothly more often results in more predictability and allows you to sort of model things as a process more, which tends to improve stakeholder trust if you become better at estimation and at least more consistent with delivery. So, second key takeaway, data governance isn't inherently bad or good. There are significant costs to excessive or insufficient data management. And I'm sure many of you have experienced having to try and get data, or having data not be well managed. I worked on a project where it turns out the government agency that hired us was unable to actually provide access to the data because it was in a different department within that agency. And that was a lack of governance that they didn't know they wouldn't be able to provide that access. So third is that data governance is an ongoing process. It's not a one-time project. It requires continuing investment and a significant amount of effort to maintain that governance. So your governance, because of that, it should really evolve alongside the business data and relevant laws and practices. So it's really sort of all of it together needs to be an ongoing activity. So with that, I'll take questions now.
Yeah, so it looks like there is a question from the chat. Could you spend a moment or two discussing implementation of a data governance system, any best practices you would recommend, or any anti-patterns to avoid?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that, Nicholas. So as far as data governance implementation goes, I would recommend looking at some of the frameworks that are out there. Again, the Data Governance Institute has one that I think is fairly good. And so there, the sort of broad way you get about doing this is, first, you convince the business that data governance is something that they should care about and has a positive return on investment. That's the number one thing. Someone at a company has to believe that managing their data well is worthwhile. And I think that should be a fairly easy argument to make because, one, all your data people will be more productive, your data will be better managed, so your data people will be more productive and happier, and you will minimize compliance and legal risks. And again, just if someone doesn't think that data governance is valuable, just Google, data breach fines, and you can find lists of companies that have been fined hundreds of millions of dollars for having data leaks, and it's good to avoid those. So first step, convince the business that it's valuable. Second step is sort of set realistic goals and create a timeline in terms of what are you trying to accomplish and sort of how are you going to implement it in terms of phases. And then usually this is where it gets real hard, is finding the time and or budget for it. Usually one of the easiest ways is to hire a couple of people full-time and be like, all right, you're the data governance person, as well as get a sort of internal coalition of people from engineering or data engineering. If you have analytics, people in the business who may be data subject matter experts in terms of how the business works and how that's represented in some data. And then take the effort to start developing policies and practices and standards based on what makes sense for your company. And then just sort of keep iterating on that.
Great, thanks. Well, it looks like there's another question in the chat. How can one grow or gain more knowledge to master data governance? This specific question asker has been working in the BI industry as well, to give some context.
Yeah, well, working in the BI industry is a great place to understand the need for data governance and to probably see it working either well or not well. If you've ever had a lot of pain and friction developing business intelligence solutions and dashboards and all of that, that's probably due to a lack of governance or governance done poorly. And so there's a whole bunch of, there are a large number of good books I think that you can read on the subject. And I think just in general, continuing to work in the industry with a thought towards process. So data governance is again, about how you enable and control and verify data management. So focusing on what makes for good data management is probably the sort of best stepping stone to get into data governance. Because once you know what good or reasonable data management looks like, data governance is really about documenting that and communicating that it should be that way in terms of data management.
Great, thanks. And then I think there was one other part of Nick's question previously. Are there any anti-patterns to avoid when it comes to implementing data governance?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to data governance and anti-patterns, I think that some of the big anti-patterns are around not thinking about the humans. Because at the end of the day, for data, there are machines doing all sorts of big data stuff, magic, advanced analytics, all that. But there are people who then have to work with this or maintain the systems. And especially at especially in large organizations like the government, very large corporations, the data governance bureaucracy tends to take over and be incredibly risk averse. And this can result in it being very, very hard to get access to data, very hard to use data. And it can make for a really unpleasant experience working in those types of entities. And so I think one of the most common anti-patterns is to not think about the humans who are involved. Because again, part of I think the promise of data governance is that you're making data not just more secure, not just more compliant, but also you're making the people who work with it more effective and efficient. Because if you have data governance and it doesn't result in higher quality data and data documentation, you're not doing data governance right. You may be doing data security and data compliance, but I think unless you get that quality part, you're not doing data governance right.
Awesome. Great. No, this is super, super helpful. I know that I'm definitely going to be looking at those frameworks because data governance is like the next big thing, right? It's the 90%, right? So once you've done your pipelines and or setting up your orchestrations, is the matter of making it secure, making it governed, etc. So I think this is a really cool topic. There's a lot of stuff to cover here, and this was a great, fantastic talk. And I think a lot of people can learn from this, and as well as moving forward, hopefully we'll see less data breaches. Fingers crossed. But that's the goal, right? People don't want to lose money. But thank you again, Will, for giving this awesome talk. You're always welcome back, as always. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap it up for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for Data Engineers Lunch. Don't forget to like and subscribe, as well as turn on the notification bell so you get notified every time we go live or post a new video. And with that, we'll